So here Nehemiah is reminding God of his own promises to his people. And then he concludes his prayer with his petition. And he only has one petition. Look how he ends his prayer here, a very specific request. Notice in verse 11, he says, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. This man that Nehemiah is referring to is the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, the most powerful man in the entire world. And here Nehemiah is petitioning God and asking God to grant him favor. And we will see in the coming weeks that Nehemiah will ask him for permission to go and rebuild the city of God. And this is how chapter 1 ends. Nehemiah simply says, I was cupbearer to the king. And right here, Nehemiah begins to see there's an opportunity for him. And Nehemiah is willing to put himself on the line. He's willing to leave the comforts of the palace and go over to the ruins and work on this problem himself. He's willing to sacrifice the security of Persia and move to the dangerous territory of Jerusalem, a city with no protection. Why? Because he's a man with a dislocated heart. And this is his moment. This is his calling. This is where he was. He remembers, I was a cupbearer to the king, and the God of heaven was calling my name. Do you remember exactly where you were when the God of heaven finally got your attention? I do. This is Nehemiah's moment right here. I remember where I was. I remember what I was doing. I remember it finally dawned on me. God Almighty has a calling on my life. I was cupbearer to the king. I remember exactly where I was when God called me into full-time vocational ministry. It was a sacred moment. Where were you when God called your name? This leads us to point 3. We've seen the passion of Nehemiah. We've seen the prayer of Nehemiah. And now we'll see the position of Nehemiah. See, what I want you to see here is that Nehemiah is praying, and he's not just asking God to solve the problem. He's asking God to allow him to be part of the solution. And so after this prayer, after he's on his knees, Nehemiah stands up with confidence and begins to see the opportunity that God has placed before him in his life. And he begins to say, I'm going to do something about this. And here, all of a sudden, he realizes his whole life's calling in this one moment. And so not only did he care enough to ask, not only did he care enough to weep, not only did he care enough to pray, but here we see Nehemiah cared enough to volunteer. Nehemiah is going to volunteer to be part of the solution to this devastating problem. And the rest of the book of Nehemiah tells that amazing story about what God does through this man. That after days and months and years and decades of this city being in ruins, God calls this man Nehemiah, and he fixes the whole thing in 52 days. It's an amazing, breathtaking story, and we'll get there in the coming weeks. But as we wrap